Just after midnight on 6 June 1944, 6 wooden aircraft carrying no engines and no way to abort their approach were gliding silently through the darkness over Normandy, aimed at 2 small bridges most of the men aboard had never heard of a few weeks earlier. There was no way to circle back if the landing went wrong. There was no way to call for help if the pilots missed their mark. A company of British airborne infantry, barely 180 men, was about to attempt one of the most precisely engineered assaults of the entire Second World War, landing gliders within yards of 2 bridges in complete darkness, storming them before the defending garrison had time to react, and holding the ground against whatever counterattack the German army could throw at them until reinforcements arrived from the sea. If they failed, German armor stationed nearby would have a clear route to the eastern flank of the entire Normandy invasion, threatening to roll up the landing beaches from the side before the operation had barely begun. If they succeeded, they would secure the left flank of D-Day before a single soldier had set foot on Sword Beach. This is the story of how a single company of British paratroopers and glider-borne infantry actually captured what would become known as Pegasus Bridge. The plan behind it, the landing that nearly defied belief, and the desperate hours that followed before help finally arrived. To understand why this mission mattered, you first need to understand the geography it was built around. 2 bridges crossed a short stretch of water southeast of what would become Sword Beach, one over the Caen Canal near the village of Bainouville, and a second over the Orne River a short distance further inland near Ranville. Together, they formed the only significant crossing point in the immediate area, controlling access between the coast and the open ground further inland where German armored reserves were stationed. Allied planners, these bridges were a double-edged problem. If German forces held them intact, panzer divisions positioned nearby could use them to counterattack directly into the flank of the invasion beaches within hours of the landing's beginning. If the bridges were destroyed by the retreating German garrison, Allied troops advancing inland from Sword Beach would find themselves cut off from reinforcement and resupply, isolated on the wrong side of a water obstacle at the worst possible moment. The solution devised by British planners was to capture both bridges intact before dawn, before the wider invasion fleet had even begun its final approach to the coast, and to hold them until relief arrived on foot from the beaches, a link-up that could not be guaranteed to happen quickly. The task went to D Company of the 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, part of the British 6th Airborne Division, under the command of a 31-year-old officer named Major John Howard. Howard was, by the account of nearly everyone who served under him, an unusually demanding commander, and the months leading up to D-Day reflected that reputation completely. Once selected for the mission, D Company underwent a punishing program of specialized training, much of it conducted without the men knowing their actual target. Mock-ups of the 2 bridges were constructed in England based on aerial reconnaissance photographs, and Howard's soldiers rehearsed the assault against these replicas repeatedly, refining exactly how each platoon would move the moment their glider came to a stop, which section would clear which trench line, and how quickly weapons could be brought to bear on known German positions. The exercises included night operations, close-quarter combat drills, and specific training in recognizing demolition charges, since one of the company's most urgent priorities on landing would be preventing German engineers from blowing the bridges before they could be secured. To confirm the unit was genuinely ready senior officers, including the 6th Airborne Division's commanding general, staged a full mock assault against paratroopers playing the role of German defenders. Watching the exercise convinced every senior officer present that D Company was the right unit for the job. Just as demanding was the training undertaken by the glider pilots, who would actually deliver Howard's men to the target. 16 pilots of the Glider Pilot Regiment began specialized training at RAF Tarrant Rushton in Dorset months before the invasion, practicing landings first in daylight, then with deliberately obscured cockpit windows, and finally at night, learning to guide their unpowered Horsa gliders to a precise touchdown using nothing but compass headings, a stopwatch, and careful timing of turns, a technique known as dead reckoning. Since there would be no radio guidance or visible landmarks to rely on once the gliders were cut loose from their tow planes in the dark. By the beginning of June 1944, both the infantry and the pilots who would carry them had rehearsed this mission until, in Howard's own later description, it had become one of the most difficult and thoroughly prepared training programs the British Army had ever run for a single operation. On the evening of 5 June 1944, D Company boarded 6 Horsa gliders at an English airfield, each aircraft towed into the night sky behind a Halifax bomber at 22:56. Major Howard later described watching his heavily laden men shuffle forward under the weight of their equipment, visibly straining under loads of weapons, ammunition, and demolition clearing gear that some of the smaller soldiers could barely manage. 3 gliders were assigned to the Caen Canal Bridge, soon to become known, from the insignia of the 6th Airborne Division, as Pegasus Bridge. The other 3 were assigned to the Orne River Bridge at Ranville. Each Horsa carried around 30 men, along with their weapons and equipment, packed into a plywood airframe with no engine of its own, entirely dependent on the accuracy of its tow release and the skill of its pilot to reach the correct landing zone in total darkness. The descent itself was disorienting in ways the men had not fully anticipated. The unpressurized gliders, dropping rapidly once released from their tow planes, caused genuine physical discomfort for troops already tense with anticipation. Below them, German sentries, alerted by the noise of the towing bombers passing overhead, had no way of knowing that silent, engineless aircraft were now descending directly toward their positions rather than continuing on with the bombers that had carried them across the channel. At the controls of the lead glider, Staff Sergeant Jim Wallwork, one of the most experienced pilots in the Glider Pilot Regiment, guided his aircraft down through the darkness using exactly the dead reckoning technique his training had drilled into him for months. What happened next would become one of the most celebrated feats of precision flying of the entire war. Wallwork's glider came down hard, skidding across open ground and coming to rest close enough to the Bainuville Bridge that some accounts describe the impact throwing him and his co-pilot through the cockpit's plexiglass nose on landing. However rough the touchdown, the result was extraordinary. The glider had landed within roughly 50 meters of its objective, in complete darkness, having navigated across the English Channel and into Normandy using little more than a compass and a stopwatch. The surprise was total. German defenders at the bridge, who had heard aircraft passing overhead throughout the evening as part of the wider bomber operations preceding the invasion, had no reason to expect an assault force to already be on the ground beside them. Before the defending garrison had time to organize any coherent response, Howard's men were out of their gliders and moving. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge led the 1st platoon across the bridge itself, storming the German positions on the far side with speed that gave the defenders almost no opportunity to react. In the fighting that followed, Brotheridge was shot and mortally wounded, becoming, by most historical accounts, the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day. His platoon pressed on regardless, clearing the German trenches and machine gun positions on the far bank within minutes. Simultaneously, the other gliders assigned to the operation delivered their own platoons to their designated positions around both bridges. Not every landing was as precise as Wallwork's. One glider, briefly delayed after mistaking a similar waterway further along the coast, eventually found its way to the correct target, while the Ranville Bridge assault, delivered by the 2nd group of 3 gliders, secured that crossing with comparatively light resistance from a smaller defending garrison. Within roughly 10 minutes of the first glider touching down, both bridges had been captured largely intact, and Howard's signaller transmitted the coded message that confirmed the mission's initial objective had been achieved. Ham and jam, ham for the Caen Canal Bridge, jam for the Ranville Bridge, both taken. Capturing the bridges in the opening minutes of D-Day was only the first half of the mission. Howard's roughly 180 men now had to hold 2 bridges deep in enemy-controlled territory against whatever German forces in the area chose to throw at them, for hours, with no certainty about exactly when relief would actually arrive. German command in the area was initially slow and confused in its response, uncertain about the true scale of the airborne landing that had apparently just captured its bridges intact. That confusion did not last. Within a relatively short time, German units began probing and then attacking Howard's positions, including at least one attempt involving armored vehicles, testing the small British force's ability to hold ground it had captured with speed rather than overwhelming numbers. Howard's men, dug into hastily prepared positions on both sides of the canal and river, fought off these early counterattacks using the weapons and ammunition they had carried in on the gliders, knowing that a serious, coordinated German armored response, if it arrived in force before Allied reinforcements reached them from the coast, could overwhelm their position entirely. Every hour that passed without that heavier counterattack materializing represented an hour closer to relief, and an hour further into the wider Allied invasion succeeding with its eastern flank still secure. Relief, when it finally came, arrived in a form that has become one of the most enduring images associated with the entire operation. Commandos under Brigadier Lord Lovat, having landed at Sword Beach earlier that morning as part of the main invasion force, pushed inland toward the bridges Howard's men had been holding since shortly after midnight. Leading them by arrangement with Lovat himself was a personal piper, Bill Millin, playing his bagpipes as the column advanced, a deliberate, almost theatrical act of defiance that became instantly and permanently associated with the link-up at Pegasus Bridge in the popular memory of the entire operation. The arrival of Lovat's commandos, roughly mid-morning on 6 June, secured Howard's position decisively, connecting the isolated airborne foothold at the bridges to the wider Allied beachhead now firmly established along the coast. What had begun as a tiny, isolated company holding 2 captured bridges against uncertain odds was now part of a continuous, secured Allied line stretching from the sea to the eastern flank of the entire Normandy invasion. It would be easy, looking back at Pegasus Bridge today, to treat it as simply one dramatic vignette among the hundreds that make up the story of D-Day. The strategic reality was considerably weightier than that. Had those 2 bridges fallen into German hands intact and been used to launch an armored counterattack into the flank of the invasion beaches in the earliest, most vulnerable hours of the landings, the consequences for the entire Normandy operation could have been severe. Had the bridges instead been destroyed by German engineers before Howard's men arrived, Allied forces advancing inland from Sword Beach would have found themselves fighting to force a river crossing under fire, at exactly the moment speed and momentum mattered most. Either outcome would have significantly complicated and potentially endangered the entire eastern flank of the D-Day invasion. Instead, a company of fewer than 200 men, delivered by 6 unpowered gliders navigated entirely by compass and stopwatch through total darkness, secured both crossings within minutes, held them against everything the local German garrison could organize in response, and connected with the main invasion force by the following morning, a precision planning and raw, close-quarter courage combining to neutralize what could otherwise have been one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities in the entire Allied invasion plan. History remembers Pegasus Bridge today largely through its most vivid individual images. Jim Wallwork's glider skidding to a halt 50 meters from its target in total darkness, Den Brotheridge falling in the first minutes of the assault, Bill Millin's bagpipes announcing the arrival of relief hours later. Behind every one of those images sits months of exhaustive rehearsal, a demanding commander who refused to accept anything less than complete readiness from his men, and a small company of British paratroopers and glider infantry who captured, and then held, the ground that kept the eastern flank of D-Day from unraveling before it had properly begun.